coming up.
How can the Georgian government refer to this law as European when all allies have condemned it as being completely incompatible with European values?
Often authoritarian regimes will use language of democracy, will mimic and try to draw parallels where there are none in order to try to justify repressive laws and justify the undermining of democracy. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that is done.
The TikTok conversation has an element around foreign ownership, but is primarily driven on the platform, its algorithms, its AI, its ability to have kind of backdoor access, whereas what we're contemplating here is more about active NGOs on the ground that are promoting ideology that might be counter to the government's line. Is that a fair characterization?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
The subcommittee will commence its study of Georgia's draft bill on foreign agents. I would like to welcome our witnesses. Center for Development and Democracy, Ketevan Chachava.
Honorable members of the House of Commons, I am deeply grateful for this opportunity to speak before you today. It is an honor, privilege, and great responsibility. My name is Ketevan Chachava. I am a civic and democracy activist from Georgia. I stand before you as a proud Georgian citizen, committed to democratic, Euro-Atlantic future of my country, and as a representative of tens of thousands of Georgians, from the younger to older, from so-called silent generation to Gen Alpha, who have taken the streets in peaceful protest for past month. The state objective of the proposed legislation is to ensure transparency concerning foreign influence and funding by implementing a specialized database. While transparency is universally valued, this legislation mandates that NGOs and independent media receiving over 20% of their funding from abroad must register as organizations carrying out the interests of a foreign power. As we continue to protest under the banner, Yes to Europe, No to Russian law, our peaceful demonstrations are met with disproportionate force and targeted violence against opposition leaders and civic activists. Thank you for strong support of Georgia's NATO membership.
Madame Natasha Landstaidet, Professor, Department du Gouvernement, par vidéoconférence.
My name is Natasha Lindstedt, and I'm a professor of government at the University of Essex, and I'm an expert on authoritarian regimes and autocratization. Foreign funding is the lifeline of NGOs in Georgia, and the new draft law, which designates NGOs that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad as operatives of foreign government, would effectively undercut NGOs in Georgia.
Thank you.
Madam Chachava, thank you very much for your commentary. May I ask, what do you believe the implications will be for your current status and registration?
Thank you for your question. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So basically, as I've mentioned, the law itself is brought by the name of the transparency, and if the transparency would be the true idea of the law, there's all the different options available with existing legislation, with the minor changes to ensure extra transparency with, for example, grants. Unfortunately, what happens with this legislation is that it is bringing the stigma that will basically make sure that no NGO in this country will register under the name that I have that is opposing on us, which is organization carrying out the interest of foreign power. Because we do not represent foreign power, so therefore what it means that if this legislation will pass, and potentially by the end of June, there is 60 days before this goes into the force, and that means that we have to all register by ourselves, or Ministry of Justice has the power to register everybody who has been receiving grants in 2023, which is more than 20% of their income, which would mean that their being in this registry literally brings a stigma, it makes it almost impossible for people to work under this name. Because again, going back to history of Georgia, foreign agents are not really the term that anybody, as a civic activist, for example, would ever agree upon. So logistically or officially, there is no official interference with registration until the first month when we are not registered, which would be potentially September, just 1 month before the elections in Georgia. That would mean the 25,000 lari fine, which is around I want to say 12,000 Canadian dollars. And then every other months, it's a 20,000 lari addition, which would directly mean that we will not be able to function if we do not register, and if we are not ready to take the stigma. It would mean that basically there would be no NGOs left in this country, and there would be no free media who is getting support from our Western partners, including US, including Canada, including EU, and so on.
Thank you, Madam Shashava. May I ask a follow-up? I understand that there's been a delegation going through Washington from Georgia Dream who claims that this legislation is designed to stave off extremist and Russian interference. In your opinion, what is the true intent of the law?
As I've mentioned, if the transparency would be the main idea, as Georgian Dream tries to raise, then nobody in this sector is actually against transparency. We are already very transparent. Every NGO on our official website, we are publishing every grant that we are receiving from our Western partners. So to be honest, this is not really the area where if there is any fraud money or potential questions, that this is the area that needs to be investigated. There is really none. So unfortunately, what we can already see for past year, since the last March, when there was this law actually was introduced firstly, there was a huge protest, and Georgian Dream actually withdrew its support to this law. And that from then, very intensive anti-Western, anti-NGO propaganda and disinformation and misinformation campaign has been carried. Even today, to be honest, it's already a huge danger because, for example, today my colleague was already beaten in the streets together with the media representatives. There's already quite a high tension and polarization, adding that the NGOs are agents, that NGOs are here to, destabilize, to have a revolution, have a colorful revolution, that everybody who has studied abroad is a potential agent. So all this ongoing disinformation and misinformation is already harming the sector so much that we can already see what is potential threat here. So as I have mentioned, bringing this Russian-style laws, this is not EU Western-style transparency approach law, right? This law has a number of issues in it, which includes one, fining, destabilizing, literally closing down the NGOs, the media organizations, as well as potentially, bringing us to exile. And as we have seen similar legislation in Russia, in Belarus, or in Kyrgyzstan, this is not a positive potential developments. So if the true side of this is a backsliding of democracy, it's going to be a true side, the true outcome of this legislation is a silencing the independent voices that are so vital in democratic societies. And that's how, the very vibrant and strong civil society of Georgia that we have been so proud of, might just disappear. So this is actually quite a dangerous zone that Georgian Dream is entering.
Do I have time, Mr. Chair, for one more question? One final question then to Professor Lindstedt. How can the Georgian government refer to this law as European when all allies have condemned it as being completely incompatible with European values?
I think that's just something that in particular regimes that are autocratizing, try to spin things in different ways, to spin it as it's European, or they could spin it that it's about their sovereignty, to really mask the real identity of, or the real reason behind this law. And I think that has already been mentioned. This is to deal with any kind of potential threat to the ruling party, because NGOs to an autocratizing country is that one big threat. They're vibrant, particularly in a country like Georgia. They are supportive of democracy, vital to supporting democracy, and they threaten the incumbent Georgia Dream Party and that government there. So they'll try to spin it in a different way, and that's something that many, like I mentioned, many autocratizing countries, they say something, but they're really doing something else. We've seen in Hungary this type of spin as well being used to justify these types of infringements on NGOs, but it's really a pretext to prevent any threats to their power.
Thank you, Ms. Linson stated. Thank you, Mr.
I know that often authoritarian regimes will use language of democracy, will mimic and try to draw parallels where there are none, in order to try to justify repressive laws and justify the undermining of democracy. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that is done and how it's being played out in Georgia.
How authoritarian regimes mimic democracy? In general, or in...
No, how they use the language of democracy to cloak the fact that what they're doing is actually very undemocratic.
That actually touches upon the last question a little bit. So it's a really good question that they, in addition to mimicking democracy like the institutions, they like to use the language of democracy. And so in some cases, these laws have been copied in the Russian law almost verbatim, like word for word. So it's not clear if Russia is directing countries to do this word for word. They're inspired by, or there's just some collaboration or coinciding interest. But we see that Russia is playing a huge role here, particularly in the countries in the post-Soviet sphere. But using the language of democracy, why do they do this? I mean, we speculate whether or not they're trying to showcase some kind of like legitimacy to their own public and convince them that they're living in a democratic society. And it's just a very common tool used by autocratizing countries to use this specific language of democracy. And we found that surveys in authoritarian regimes, countries that are authoritarian, they're the people living in them sometimes are led to believe that they do live in a democracy and that the elections are relatively free and fair. And that just shows how strong some of these propaganda campaigns have been. I think in the Georgian case, this is a much more difficult case for the leading the regime, the Georgia Dream Party, to convince the public that what they're doing is because of democratic reasons. I think that a lot of the Georgian public is well aware of what's happening, and they can't, have the wool pulled over their eyes. But they use this type of lingo.
Can you wrap it out, please? We are out of time, please.
Yeah, they lose this type of lingo. It's often something that they do.
What would you say to people who might be watching this committee, looking at kind of even just your office setup with an American flag, a NATO flag, a European Union flag, a Ukrainian flag? What would you say to people who might look at that and say, gosh, this isn't really an organization kind of centered and completely focused on Georgia? I want to offer you the opportunity just to respond to that so that we can take that off the table.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And actually, you are saying my last name perfectly. So just to give a short background about Georgia, right? We are in our neighbor Russia is occupying 20% of our country. Georgians have been fighting to survive for many centuries, and the choice of Georgian people to move forward with a democratic, free society has been made when we got independency. So since for last over 35 years, Georgians have been fighting. We have been dying for the freedom. We have been moving forward to become the members of NATO and EU. And every government that has won any election in this country has always been pro-Western and has been very clear that NATO, EU is the future for Georgia. This is where we strive. So when it comes to Center for Development and Democracy, thank you for a question and opportunity to say a few words about us. We have been established in 2008, actually when Russia has occupied additional parts of Georgia, and we were under the war. For us, it is crucial that we bring our country closer to you. One of our main finding principles has been to support awareness raising, to work with people, and we actually work with the religious leaders very closely. We work with different groups of society. We try to bring dialogue. We try to overcome the polarization that our country is facing. And as you mentioned, yes, we are not hiding. Yes, it's very clear where we stand because this is what the mission and vision of our state has been. This is a constitution of Georgia that Article 78 says that Georgia is going to become a member of EU and NATO, and that's the mission of our country and every elected official in this country. So, of course, we as a civil society, we fight for freedom. We fight for freedom of expression. We fight for freedom of speech. We fight for human rights. We fight for democracy. We observe elections. We want to ensure the voters have the rights and their rights are secured. So yes, and I myself have been educated. I just graduated from King's College London with the UK funding. I have been lucky to study in the US, and I have been lucky to receive Canadian support as well. So of course we try to bring our partners here and we try to work together.
Okay, my next question would be to Professor Lindstedt. Recognizing that, how would you help us, because I know that you're an expert in comparative politics, how would you help us kind of unpack what is being proposed in Georgia and this kind of reaction that we're seeing in the West towards entities like TikTok, for instance?
Right. So it's my understanding that some of the issues related to TikTok have to do with concerns about surveillance and so forth, and don't have anything to do really with supporting democracy. And in this case, these NGO laws are about really trying to cut at the heart of groups that are so vital for democracy, transparency, free flowing of information, and that aren't about surveilling the population. It's a really good question, but I think there's really huge differences here because some of the people that are working for these NGOs, it's not foreigners who are working there. They are Georgians who are working there, and they rely on foreign funding to keep them afloat. And they're trying to help promote democratic values in their own country, which are important for any country that is trying to support free elections, civil society, etc., all these types of things. So that's where I would see the difference lies.
It's your testimony that I totally appreciate that. Yeah, I found it very helpful. The TikTok conversation has an element around foreign ownership, but is primarily driven on the platform, its algorithms, its AI, its ability to have kind of backdoor access, whereas what we're contemplating here is more about active NGOs on the ground that are promoting ideology that might be counter to the government's line. Is that a fair characterization?
Exactly. They're threatening to
I'm going to ask a
incumbent
follow-up.
Georgia Dream Party.
Yeah, let's segue to that. It's a good segue. The Georgian Dream Party has claimed that the Foreign Agents Bill aims to increase transparency in foreign funding, and it says that it draws inspiration from Western laws like the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act. You'll note likely that here in Canada, one of the outcomes or one of the recommendations on foreign interference is a kind of a foreign agents registry framework as well. So could you perhaps give us a little understanding about what are the distinctions between Georgia's Foreign Agents Bill and the U.S. FARA Act?
I think in this instance, we're talking about the Georgia Dream Party being threatened by its own people who want democracy, whether it be the opposition, whether it be journalists, whether it be academics, people that work for NGOs, rather than some sort of foreign entity. And that's where, to me, the distinction lies, that it isn't about the free flow of information that is so critical in a democracy. It's about trying to undercut people who are trying to share transparency and information, support civil society.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. I'm sorry to cut you. Time is out.